Yes, I get the joy and privilege of serving your children and your young adults, and it is definitely a joy and privilege. Both Caitlin and I very much enjoy being able to pour into your children, pour into your slightly older children, slightly less immature children at that point. And I think by the end of today, between Wednesday and today, I will have taught or preached 8 times. So hopefully I've got it a little more in my voice, a little more just, I've been dealing with like a sinus drip, so it's just constantly bothering me. And I am on live stream, which is my wife's greatest fear currently. I'm surprised she's even in here because she's stressing out. She's like, okay, Chaz hasn't said anything dumb yet. But officially, we want y'all to know that we as a church, Community Bible Church, is Christ-centered, Christ-focused. We love Jesus and go Tigers because, you know, we are both LSU grads. And if you didn't know, last night LSU played University of Florida in the first of potentially 3 games in the College Baseball World Series. And we're up 1-0. So, you know, I'm sorry for y'all if you are a Florida native or just have bad taste in teams. So we are in Hebrews, and we have been in Hebrews forever. But that's a good thing. Hebrews is a great book. Hebrews is a theological dissertation that really points us to the fact that Jesus is what? Okay, it's up there. Good. Jesus is better. Jesus is greater. Jesus is the ultimate. And the entire book of Hebrews is pointing us to this fact that Jesus is better. Pointing us, encouraging us, exhorting us to live our lives because Jesus is better. In fact, the first 10 chapters of the book systematically lays it out why Jesus is better in comparison to all the things that the Hebrew audience would have understood. Because if you understand the context and the background of the book, you understand that the author is writing to an audience of first to second generation Judaism, people who've been converted from Judaism into Christianity. So they've come out of Judaism into Christianity, and some of them, because of persecution, because of trials, because of suffering, are thinking about going back. And so the author is laying out this whole aspect to show that Jesus is greater. Jesus is greater than the prophets. Jesus is greater than the angels. Jesus is greater than Abraham, greater than Moses, greater than Aaron in the priesthood, greater than the sacrificial system, greater than the old covenant. And the whole time building to this premise, building to this whole idea that Jesus is superior in every way. So why turn back? Why go away from that? So that's really what this entire book is all about. And really up until midway through chapter 10, midway through Hebrews chapter 10, it was theology. And now he's made a switch to doxology. That is, what we believe should now affect how we live. And so this is where we're at. This is where we've been for a good bit of the last 4 or 5 weeks, right? Because we've been in Hebrews 11 for the last 4 weeks for sure, and then if you go back. So we've been kind of in this area where we've made the shift from what we believe to how we live it for a little over a month now. And really, I want y'all to understand that where we're going to be going is how to live our faith in uncertainty. Because that's what life is. It's just a lot of uncertainty. And for us, as we are taking our daily steps, as we are going through our daily motions, we need to understand, how is it that we live our faith? How is it that we pursue faith when nothing seems to be going correctly? And so we're going to be in chapter 11, verse 32 through 40 today. So y'all can follow on the screen as I read the text. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept their release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens in the caves of the earth. And all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had promised something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. Now, before we kind of start breaking down this section, I want us to kind of gear our minds a different way, because like I said, we've been in this passage for the last 5 weeks, and we've kind of taken section by section, chunk by chunk, kind of hyper-focused on those things. But I want us to kind of take a step back and see the larger context of what's going on. Because we are so focused on these individual stories of the Old Testament believers, by faith Abraham, by faith Moses, by faith this person, by faith that person, that when we take a step back and we look at the larger context, we understand that this passage is actually meant to be an encouragement to us. In fact, if you take a step back and go to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 32, this actually starts off this whole mindset that the author's really driving home to us. So we're going to kind of backtrack, and we're going to read through some verses that give the overall trajectory of this entire passage, starting from Hebrews chapter 32. That's going to end today with our kind of how we sum it up. And we're going to get a larger view of this encouragement and exhortation for us to run the race. Because it says in 32, "But recall the former days when you, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised." Keep that in mind as we jump now to 11, 1 and 2. "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation." And you jump down to verse 13. That says, "But these people of old all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland, and if they've been thinking of a land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." Which then brings us back to verse 39. "And all of these, though commended through their faith," all of these Old Testament believers did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. And when we understand the larger context, and I don't know if you noticed this, I didn't pick and choose verses just to kind of make it somewhat palatable to preach a message or anything like that. When you go back there, he's drawing a point for us, bringing it to us, and then using examples. So those were the main points of the message, but then in the midst of it, he was using the Old Testament believers to reinforce that point. By faith, these people, by faith, those people. Look to their testimony, look to their life, look to how they ran their race as you're running yours. Run with endurance like them. Don't give up. Understand that there is a process, and it's just you pursuing God, right? Simple. All we need to know, right? They ran their race, now you need to run yours. Sermon's done, we can go home. But if it was that simple, then why is the author having to encourage us and exhort us and tell us to not lose our confidence? Why is the author having to give all of these examples to us if the reality is it's just a simple walk through life and you'll get there? I don't think any of us believe that life is simple. And I don't think any of us have led a life that is just easy along the way. I think of the stories I know. I think of the individuals I communicate with on a consistent basis. And I know we all have struggles. I know we all have setbacks. I know we all have different aspects that we deal with. And we know that life is not easy. And roadblocks, curveballs, they're all coming constantly. And so how do we live in the uncertainty? How do we live in the everyday aspect of understanding how to walk in faith, how to walk consistently for the Lord? And when we look to the Old Testament believers, we're actually confronted with this weird reality. And we're confronted with this idea that we may never see the final product. That you may never actually get to experience what you thought your faith was all about in one form or fashion, right? Because if you look at the stories, Abraham, when he died, what did he have? I mean, he left the land of Ur to go to the land that the Lord promised him, but when he died, all he had was a field with his grave. Moses did all of these great things. He led the people through the Red Sea, did all of these fantastic things, but he was never able to enter the promised land because of his own sinfulness. He was able to look over it, but he never was able to see it, walk into it. And for us to understand, we may never see that final product. We may never have the perfect marriage. We may never have the aspect to be able to have financial security and be able to contribute to Pastor Joel's building fund. Shameless plug. We may never be able to fully understand or see the repentance of a prodigal child or the reconciliation of a broken relationship. And what do you do in the midst of that? How do we handle that when we are looking to live in faith and we're trying as hard as we can to do everything right and we're failing to have the tangible effects of it? We're like, but if we just follow Jesus, shouldn't everything work out between me and my wife? Can't that just be a tangible aspect of my faith that I just experience here? And I'd love to say yes for everyone, but I think the reality is no, not all the time. Because as weird as it is, your faith is not dependent on your spouse. It's not dependent on your children. It's not dependent on your financial security. Your faith is dependent on one thing and one thing alone. And what we see is that our faith is shown in our uncertainty. We start to live our life in the uncertainty, and the reality is it shows our heart, and it shows our mind, and it shows our trajectory because we know that it is Christ that we're living for. If we had the perfect marriage, well, would we keep pursuing in faith? And he kind of alludes to this in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, which don't worry about throwing that up because I'm throwing this on y'all. Y'all don't even know this. But he says, like, if they had a homeland they could go to, they would have gone to it. They wouldn't have gone to it, and that would have been their focus, and they would have been done. And actually, you see this later on in Joshua when God's like, okay, go take the land. And they walk into Joshua, and they walk into the promised land. They settle down, and they kind of just get comfortable because they thought they had achieved what they wanted. But what we understand is what we want versus what we need is two different things, and it's Christ that we need. It's Christ that is promised. And in the end, our faith and uncertainty, what we understand to live and to pursue in the midst, if it's misplaced, then it's going to even be more uncertain along the way. So we see what the author is trying to drive us toward, that our faith and uncertainty is pushing us toward something greater. 19 times the author uses the term by faith. He references over 25 different individuals that span over 3,000 years. The Old Testament narrative starts with Abel. Really, it starts with creation account, but we'll just start at Abel, and goes essentially all the way through almost the New Testament times. You're talking about occupation by Assyria, Babylon, Greek, Sparta, Rome, whoever, all these different people that have come in and taken over. And a whole lot of life happens in 3,000 years. I don't know if y'all know that, but that's a lot of life. A whole lot of people lived in faith, never seeing that final product, lived in faith, only experiencing uncertainty. And in fact, we get greeted with some of these examples in verse 32 of chapter 11. It says, "What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises and stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth. Caves of the earth. So many stories right there. Like, I think the last 5 weeks I had 5 people. Now we have like 15, 20 people. And so now we're going to do a biopic on each of them, right? No. You go through it and you're like, okay, well, it starts with Gideon, Barak, Samson, David. We're like, oh, the interesting stories. But then at the end, it's like, oh, wait, no, they're being tortured and killed. And I mean, I think I know everybody's stories well enough to know that nobody in here is being tortured or killed at the present moment, at least. I don't know, maybe Caitlin's being tortured hearing me preach for the 3rd time. But life wasn't certain for 3,000 years of people. And life's not going to be certain for you. I mean, the one thing we know is life is uncertain. The one thing we know is that the struggle is there for each of us, and in different ways and in different levels. And you go through the stories, and they're dealing with the same thing. And the question is, how do you run? How do you go on? How do you pursue? How do you take the necessary steps on a daily basis when it's just everything seems to be falling apart from you, around you? And even verse 38, which is on the screen, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. Like, these people were homeless at this point, being pushed out of what they knew and what they were comfortable about, and seeking refuge to avoid death. And so what do you do in the uncertainty? And it seems simple, but you press onward. You can't do anything else but to press onward. I think last week, Pastor Ray, he was talking at the end, he was talking about kind of this aspect for fathers who haven't stepped up in their lives to take ownership. And he said, you may not know what to do, but the next thing that you need to do is take a step in faith, a step toward Christ, knowing that he's going to provide that next step for you. And that is just following daily, pressing onward daily in that step for the duration, however long it may be. For us, we just want to be at the finish line. We just want to see, we're like, okay, I've achieved it. But that's not the guarantee for us. The guarantee is that we have to walk in faith every day. We have to press onward in doubt. I mean, you talk about the story of Gideon, and we highlight Gideon in Sunday school as this figure. Oh yeah, he had faith, and no, he had doubt. Like he set up a bath mat outside, and he's like, oh, if it's wet in the morning, then I know God's with me. If everything else is dry around it. And then God made that happen, and he's like, oh, fooled you, God. I still got a little more doubt. Let's flip-flop it. Everything's wet around it, but the bath mat is dry. And God does that, and then he's like, okay, I'll go. And he's full of doubt. He didn't want to be the guy that had to lead the charge because he knows if it goes wrong, he's dead. You look at Moses talking to a burning bush. God's calling him saying, hey, I'm going to lead you. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to do everything you need for you to lead my people out. And he's like, I don't talk good. Doubt. But it's in Christ that we overcome doubt. We have to press onward through the doubt because the reality is the doubt's there. I guarantee everyone in here deals with doubt. But faith overcomes doubt. We press onward and struggle. Look at the story of Samson. The man was given everything. He was like dedicated to God. God gave him just strength and everything to do the business that he had to do. To rule the nation of Israel in a right way. And Samson throws it away. Literally, cuts his hair off and throws it away. It's a really bad decision. That was a pity laugh by Joel. Throws it away, completely disowns his faith at one point, only to realize at the very end of his life, when there's no hope, there's no aspect of him ever getting away, his eyes are gouged out, he's chained to 2 pillars, and at that point he has a come to Jesus moment. It comes back to faith in God and says, like, okay, in my struggle, in my failures, in my weakness, help me at this at least moment. And it crushed him. You know, it's not like he got to go live a happy life after that, but he did the will of God in the moment. Press onwards in your struggles. Press onward in your trials and sufferings. And just to go back to the people, like literally wearing skins of sheep and goats, being tortured, being sawn in two, being mocked and flogged, being persecuted and chased all around, hiding in caves and in these spots. Like going through the trials, going through the suffering, like our call is to run the race of endurance no matter where we're at, no matter what the life stage we're in. But then you get to verse 39 again, and it says, and all of these Old Testament believers, and all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Does that mean God's not faithful? Does that mean that God's not faithful to his people that are running to him? I don't think that's what the verse is intending. I don't think it's what it's intending, because if you go to verse 40, it kind of changes the look of it. It says, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. And here's the caveat to that, and it's point 4, faith is and needs to be focused on Christ. And here's the reality of what we see in the Old Testament and even what we see now. The Old Testament believers had a faith forward looking to Christ, the coming Messiah. The New Testament believers have a rear-facing faith that looks back to the Messiah who's come. We're all pointing at the same person. We're all pointing to Jesus because why? Jesus is greater. This whole book, this whole chapter is pointing to Jesus being greater. Greater than your struggles, greater than your doubt, greater than your trials, greater than your best dreams and hopes and promises. And when we understand that Jesus is greater, when we understand that Jesus is the reason for our faith and the pursuit of our faith and all that we need in our faith, it helps us to take that step after step. Run the race of endurance, even if it becomes a crawl, because Jesus is greater. Jesus is greater than our uncertainty. He's greater than any temporarily unfulfilled promise, because he's the final fulfillment of all promises. And when you look at verse 40, it says, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should be made perfect. And I don't know if you notice this, there's a change in pronouns. The entire book or chapter of 11, it's been they. By faith, they. By faith, that person. By faith, the Old Testament believers. And now it shifts to us. And we're united by one thing at this point, Christ. The promise for the Old Testament believer was Christ. The promise for the New Testament believer is Christ. It all points to Christ. It all brings us back to Christ because he is that fulfillment. And I said when we started this that we were going to look at a broader context. We're going to start in chapter 10, verse 32, and bring it back and kind of look at this bigger aspect of how this is an encouragement to us New Testament believers that uses the Old Testament believers to help us to look to endure and run the race. And I said, we looked through a set of verses, but there was one set that I didn't read, and I did that intentionally because Joel told me I couldn't. He said he wanted to preach that next week, but I'm going to take a little bit. Forgive me for that. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. And it says this, therefore, since we are surrounded so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Chapter 10, 32 through 38. Don't throw your confidence away. Run the race of endurance and faith. Chapter 11. Look to the Old Testament believers who ran that endurance of faith. Let their testimonies encourage you to run the same race of faith in your life, no matter what the scenario is, no matter how uncertain life is. Then in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. All the time knowing that it's because of Jesus who is your author and perfecter of your faith. Looking to him, letting him be your destination, letting him be your focal point, allowing him to be the one that both leads you, directs you, and perseveres you the whole way. Look to Jesus because Jesus is better. Because Jesus is greater. Because Jesus is the only thing in this life of uncertainty that is certain for us. While the band's about to come back up, I just want to say thank you all for the opportunity to teach and preach today. And let's close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for who you are. And we thank you for all that you've done and all that you provide in our lives, Lord. And just in the midst of our lives, in the midst of the doubt, in the midst of the uncertainty, to know that you are the one commonality that is true. That you are the firm foundation. That you are the promise that we cling to, that we hope in, that we have faith in, and to know that you are better in every way. Better than anything we could think of, but better than everything we could hope for as well. Help us to live in that. Help us to walk in that. In your holy name, amen.